Welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. Last time we left off discussing the fatal hit on early member and icon of the Mexican Mafia, Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena. The hit on Cadena was not the end of it. La M soon retaliated at the California training facility when on December 25th, 1972, two NF were killed by some memeros in what would be called the Christmas Day Massacre. March 1973, OG Emero Maravilla shot caller and by then NF associate Luis Araujo and Mexican Mafia founder Huerta Flores engaged in a fistfight in a CIM visiting room. Luckily, authorities broke it up in time before somebody was killed. As I spoke of in part 1, Tony Casas dealt with Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena many times, so much so that he was accused of being an MA sympathizer by some, and even more so when after he retired from CDC, he often served as a defense expert. He also dealt directly with Joe Morgan and once told me a very funny story of how he went to visit CIM on an investigation. The facility is very large, so sometimes he would use a bicycle to ride from unit to unit. One day, the bike he used was gone from in front of a building where he had parked it at. He started asking convicts in the vicinity where his bike was, and they all just shrugged. Then all of a sudden, he saw Joe Morgan coming towards him, riding his bicycle, and all the cons were laughing. Another true story that not many people know about. As I mentioned previously, Babo Sosa was eventually elected the number one guy in the NF organization, and Death Row Joe was made his first captain. In July 1973, the NF wrote a new constitution that no longer had any Raza concepts as goals, as was the case under Chalo Hernandez when they first started. As I've stated in a few previous videos, some old school NF, including Death Row Joe, stated that the NF was never about the gente, and that they always had a mob mentality. That simply is not true. I have Chalo's memoirs and have shown the Nuestra Familia Mexicana original constitution many times as proof that when they first started, they were a pro-revolutionary organization with goals of raising consciousness and unity amongst La Raza. The radical left Venceremos revolutionary organization even tried to get them to work under their direction, and Venceremos hoped that the NF and MA, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla family would unite to off some more pigs. Tony Casas, who knew all of the major players in the MA and NF as being a key member of the prison gang task force, was given all reports on both organizations and told me that Babo viewed himself as a young Michael Corleone from the Godfather movie that had recently been released. I believe what happened is the NF under Babo and Death Row Joe rewrote their history. You see, when the NF Nuestra Familia Mexicana first started, Babo wanted to join, but Chalo rejected him, and Babo never forgot this act of disrespect. At the same time period when the NF Constitution was being rewritten by Babo and Death Row Joe, they smutted Chalo up by accusing him of stealing approximately $1,000 from the NF bank. They also made rules against members using heroin, but in truth, it was Babo and Death Row Joe who stole funds and using heroin, all at the time they were having other members killed for it. Another thing that Babo and Death Row Joe decided was that they needed to clean house of any other threats or weak links. On June 19, 1975, original NFM member Black Jess Valenzuela was killed at CIM by the NF's Joker Mendoza. It was long suspected that Valenzuela had been an informant, something that Bill Hankins' book, Alpha Guard, shows to be true. Valenzuela had just spoken to the parole board, and word got out that he was a snitch. So the NF decided they could not afford to have him associated with them any longer. On November 26, 1976, Familia Cinco affiliate Peter Leclerc was murdered at CIM by Michael Manos Sosa and Richard Casper Castro. As I mentioned several times previously, there seems to be some confusion by some about Familia Cinco. It was not a predecessor to the NF. It was a totally separate group led by David Corona from Maravilla, and it was still active until the mid-1970s. So there's no way that the NF replaced it. Towards the latter part of 1975, Rudy Old Folks Patino from San Jose was sent down by the NF leadership to help the Chino sinners who were supporting the NF in their war against the Mexican Mafia. In 1976, the NF established the Chino Regiment under Luis the Rat Rodriguez from Pomona, with the bulk of the regiment being members from the Chino Sinners, who were engaged in a bloody battle out in the streets with the Ontario Black Angels, who were in turn backed up by the MA. Several individuals from the Sinners were made NF members, and several from the Black Angels were made MA. It's interesting to me that most of nearby Pomona 12th Street were backed up by the MA also, but P12 member Tarzan Castaneda became a major figure in the NF and remained accepted as a respected carnal until his death. To be clear, the Chino Centers also produced some MA, as there was no real clear Sur 13 or Norte 14 umbrellas back then. I will probably do a video on that development, as there seems to be a lot of confusion and disagreement on that topic too. By the late 1970s, there were really not a lot of NF at CIM any longer, as many of the Southern California NF regiments ceased to exist. By 1978, most NF were slammed down due to the impending RICO case and their internal war between the Babo Sosa Death Row Joe faction and the Black Bob Brown Bob factions, who soon proved to be victorious, but at a great cost. During this time period, the NF went from approximately 700 members to barely 100. This was a big problem for the organization for several years, until they created the Nuestra Raza / Northern Structure in the early 1980s that recruited almost exclusively from the Norte, so the vast majority of them were not received at CIM. As in many cases, there were exceptions. Understand that former NF heavyweight Frank Joker Mendoza was hit at CIM in February of 1982 by Black Guerrilla Family General Ricky Bonville. As most of you know, usually the BGF and NF were allies, but you have to remember this was the time period when the NF's Black Bob faction was trying to get rid of any remnants of the old Babo Sosa faction, so Bonville may have done it to curry favor to the new NF Mesa. It was a different story, however, about the MA and AB. Robert Blinky Griffin slashed the throat from ear to ear of an AB named Stephen T-Bone Gibson at CIM on October 13, 1980, with the assistance of AB member Junior Snyder, who stabbed Gibson 3 times more in the back, killing him for bad-mouthing their allies in the MA. It is reported that MA members and shot callers Ralph Vito Rodriguez and Benjamin Topo Peters were on the yard at the same time of the assault, as well as MA honorary godfather Joe Morgan, who testified in court that Griffin did not do the hit, even though he was highly satisfied with the AB's actions. Blinky went to war with Wendell Blue Norris when Griffin created a new AB ruling council at CIM in the early 1980s and cut Blue out. Blinky asserted his authority often on the commission, such as when he gave approval for the July 3, 1982 death of Stephen Loser Clark, who was hit 37 times at Palm Hall by Clifford One-Eye Smith while Michael Judah Mike Thompson held him. Former MA shot caller Ernest Chuco Castro testified in the mid-1990s RICO case that Benjamin Topo Peters prepared him for membership in the Mexican Mafia while both were incarcerated at CIM in the 1980s. He recounted Peters' explanation to him that the route to membership was this: if the Mafia has any enemies, they were to also be his enemies, and as long as he took care of them by stabbing them, he would eventually become a member. Usually the Mexican Mafia required a vote of 3 members to make a carnal, or to murdering an existing carnal, but there was not any vote required from a member to kill a non-member. I believe that later changed so that it didn't kick off a race war. For instance, Castro testified in 1991 while he was at Chino that he, Charlie Brown Manriquez, and other Mexican Mafia members agreed to stab 2 individuals, Colorado and Smiley. Castro then stabbed Colorado Arias, but Manriquez failed to stab Smiley despite 2 opportunities to do so. When Peters later transferred to CIM, Chuco informed him of Manriquez's cowardice, and Topo told Chuco that he could do whatever he felt was right, which Castro interpreted as meaning he could kill Manriquez. Charlie Brown Manriquez was an advisor to American Me and was killed shortly after the movie was released. The film was not the only reason he was killed, but he and the other 2 had multiple issues with Lame long before the film was made, and it is my strong belief that their participation played a major role in their deaths.
Welcome inside the California Institute for Men at Chino. This is home to convicted felons, many of whom hail from Orange County. It's an impersonal place, even threatening to the uninitiated, and gang activity is alive, even in this strictly disciplined environment. Normal routine at Chino allows prisoners only 10 hours of outside activity each week. That means working out, baseball, and hours of circling the compound under the watchful eyes of the armed guard in the tower. Indoors, inmates are restricted to cell blocks where two men may live in a room the size of a small bathroom. Contact is reduced to shouts from one cell to another, and meals are served directly to the cell to reduce movement in confined spaces. Chino was built in 1941 to hold about 2,500 men. Nearly 50 years later, it holds 6,000, 2.5 times its intended capacity. The overcrowding leads to unnatural stresses.
Of course, the inmates are strained on the fact that they are housed sometimes in day rooms, card rooms, gymnasiums, open dorm settings.
While prison officials recognize that they have far exceeded the capacity of design, they feel their hands are tied by the courts.
We just start taking them in as the courts present them to us.
This may be an immediate solution for keeping criminals off the street, argue criminologists, but they say it does very little in terms of preparing a convict for his return to society.
And I have a feel for how the victims, the hostility they feel, want to punish them, more prisons and so forth. Not doing very much. I feel that hostility too. I'd like to do something to them, but in terms of what it accomplished for society is not very much.
Instead, supporters of this philosophy argue that prisons exist strictly for punishment and say that doesn't protect society.
Kevin Cooper was sentenced for 2 burglaries under a false name and escaped from CIM in 1983. I recall this incident very clearly, and it was major headlines in all the papers, and residents in the area were scared to death that a dangerous killer was on the loose. 3 days after Cooper's escape, 4 people were found dead in nearby Chino Hills, and Cooper was later convicted of murdering them and sent to San Quentin's death row. He is currently 67 years old and housed at the Stockton Healthcare Center. There have been some staff at CIM as well as other joints who have been corrupt as well as heroic. Shane Allen Ziska was a correctional officer at CIM from 1984 to 2000. In 2004, he was arrested for helping the Nazi lowriders distribute drugs and assault inmates while he was employed at CIM. He ended up being sentenced to 17 years and was released in 2021. You can check out my videos on the NLR and P9, usually past support groups for the AB, if you are not familiar with them. Correctional Officer Manuel Gonzalez was stabbed to death at CIM in 2005 by an East Coast Crip. Investigation found that prison overcrowding, understaffing, and failure to segregate this particular inmate who had a history of violent behavior were all factors in C.O. Gonzalez's death. In July 2007, CDC agreed to pay a $1.2 million settlement to the officer's family. On August 8, 2009, a prison riot broke out at CIM, which involved over 250 inmates and took more than 12 hours to put down. This particular riot involved Sureños versus the Africanos. Massive damage was caused, and I understand approximately 50 inmates were taken to nearby hospitals. Currently, CIM is no longer known as the Prison Without Walls, which was its nickname when it first started. And in August 2020, its role as a reception center ended. I will very briefly mention the California Institution for Women. I probably need to do a separate video on the role of women in prison gangs, but CIW was originally dedicated in Tehachapi in 1932. However, after a 1952 earthquake, the females were moved to a new facility where CIW is currently housed, near Corona. There have been some high-profile females housed at CIW, including Emily Harris, member of the Radical Sudanese Liberation Army, who were responsible for the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, as well as members of Charles Manson's family, who also did time there. Before I go, I'd like to put in a plug in for another mentor of mine who is part of prison gang task forces, California, Arizona, New Mexico, as well as sitting on the board of the National Major Gang Task Force, and was an advisor to the International Latino Gang Investigators Association. That is Frank Paco Marcel, who has a recent manuscript he wrote about his 3 decades of a 42-year career in law enforcement, moving in and out of corrections institutions. Paco studied the behaviors of career criminals and advised others across the United States about how career criminals think and why crime is their way of life. His book is available on Amazon.com. Check it out if you can. So that's all I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed what you heard. Be back soon for covering more prisons within the California Department of Corrections. Now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for gangsters, cops, and politicians.